Ernest Shackleton is remembered as a hero, the man who kept every one of his men alive through an Antarctic nightmare. But behind the legend is something darker. The ship never reached Antarctica. It was crushed. The mission was a failure. And while Shackleton floated on ice trying to save his crew, another group, the Aurora Team, they were collapsing, they had scurvy, they were starving and dying, following a plan that Shackleton had already abandoned. His story is one of survival, but also one of debts, obsession, a crumbling marriage, and a man who couldn't stop pushing forward, no matter the cost. This is the real story of Shackleton's endurance. These days, Shackleton's name gets thrown around like he was some kind of adventure god, a symbol of resilience, leadership, and grit. But the man behind the legend was a lot more complicated. So let's start at the beginning. Ernest Shackleton was born in 1874, and he came from a big Irish family, 10 kids, not a lot of money, and plenty of chaos. The family moved to England when he was young, and his home life wasn't exactly simple. His mother was often ill, and a lot of the childcare fell to his father, his grandmother, and a rotating crew of female relatives. And he was awkward in school, he was always late, clumsy at sports, but apparently he had such entertaining excuses that people let it slide. Even as a teenager, he could really hold a crowd. He had a flair for storytelling, and he once convinced his sister that a monument in London had been built in his honor. And he could spin a story. He'd win a room and make you believe in something bigger. And he had the drive to chase it, no matter what the cost. And that mix would become his greatest superpower and his biggest curse. Later on, adventure called him. So at 16, Shackleton joined the Merchant Navy. Not the Royal Navy, which was the usual path for polar explorers at the time, but Shackleton never really followed the usual path. And while he was learning, he had to learn the name of over 200 ropes on one ship, and if he messed up, somebody would whack him with the knotted rope end. He sailed to Cape Horn, enduring brutal storms and icebergs. The captain of that ship called him the most pig-headed, obstinate boy I have ever come across. And this was a man who had actually dealt with murderers on his ship. But still, Shackleton climbed the ranks fast. By 24, he earned his Master Mariner's Certificate, one of the youngest officers in Britain allowed to command a ship anywhere in the world. But it wasn't enough for him. He didn't just want to sail the oceans, he wanted to conquer them. And he wanted to make history. In 1897, he met Emily Dorman, a friend of his sister's. He was 23 and she was 29. And Shackleton fell for her. Winning her love was one thing, but winning over her wealthy father was another challenge. So to impress them both, Shackleton joined the Union Castle Line, a prestigious merchant service that sailed between England and South Africa. It wasn't quite the Navy, but it was close enough to adventure for him. When a journalist later asked him why he wanted to explore, Shackleton described a dream he had at 22. Then a moment at sea that changed everything. He was standing alone on the bridge staring north, feeling something pull him towards the ice. And that feeling never left him. And Shackleton was always restless. He couldn't stand monotony, couldn't bear the thought of his best years slipping away. The ordinary, just living an ordinary life, felt like a slow death to him. Stories of polar explorers lit a fire in his imagination. And at the time, neither the North or the South Pole had been reached. So the greatest prize in exploration was still up for grabs. In 1901, Shackleton finally got his chance to go to Antarctica. He took a position on Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery Expedition. It was Britain's big comeback in polar exploration, and to a restless young officer stuck hauling mail on steamships, it might as well have been a mission to the moon. Breathtaking, punishingly cold, and full of surprises even seasoned sailors hadn't faced. But a wild part of this story is that neither Shackleton nor Scott were obsessed with Antarctica. Not really. They weren't polar romantics, but they were ambitious men chasing status, legacy. And this expedition, well, it was their golden ticket to fame. Scott was a pure Navy guy. Meticulous, controlled, always in uniform, probably even ironed his socks. But Shackleton was the opposite. He was impulsive, restless, and bold to the point of recklessness. But people really liked him, and he could win anyone over. On August 1st, 1901, Shackleton joined Scott's Discovery Expedition as a junior officer, one of the lucky ones chosen to go where no Brit had gone before. They stopped in Cape Town in New Zealand to resupply and then pushed through the ice-packed Ross Sea. And it only took them 4 days, which was really quick at the time, and that might have planted something dangerous in Shackleton's mind, that maybe Antarctica wasn't as quite as unforgiving as people had said. 5 months after leaving England, they reached McMurdo Sound, and he had made it. At first, it was everything he dreamed of: adrenaline, camaraderie, and the thrill of pushing limits. He saw his first Antarctic sunrise. They fumbled through ski lessons, and Shackleton hated every moment of it. He couldn't stand learning things slowly and didn't have the patience that it took to learn how to ski. But this is when he got his first taste of leadership, when they took a short trial run onto the ice. It was just a few days with a few men, nothing huge or dramatic or complicated, but it lit a fire in Shackleton. That thrill of command and of making the call, he liked it a lot. But this wasn't exactly a polished operation. At one point, they tried launching a hot air balloon in a wicker basket to get the first aerial photos of Antarctica. The balloon worked only briefly, and then they couldn't take it up again. But that blend of chaos and ambition was exactly what Shackleton was looking for. And then reality hit. It came crashing down fast on them. The cold was worse than anyone expected. The food ran out, the dogs died, and Shackleton, already asthmatic, started coughing up blood. A lot of the men had not even camped before, and they didn't know how to even pitch a tent or light the stoves. But still, they managed to climb a Nunatak, which is a lone rock outcrop rising out of the ice, with no mountaineering experience. Shackleton actually led them to the top. It wasn't quite Everest or anything like that, but it was enough to just give him a glimpse of who he might become. Back at camp, Shackleton launched the South Polar Times, which was a handwritten newsletter filled with jokes and cartoons to kind of entertain the crew. Because Shackleton understood something that Scott didn't. That it wasn't the cold that broke men, it was the silence and the dread. Scott followed rank and protocol, but Shackleton kept spirits alive and he kept the men feeling human. And then they started to gravitate towards him. Scott still held the title of expedition leader, but Shackleton was quietly winning over the crew. By early 1902, the Discovery was frozen solid into the Ross Sea. The expedition was stuck in Antarctica for the winter, whether they liked it or not. But that didn't stop Scott from pushing deeper inland. He wanted to break the farthest south record, which was set just 2 years earlier. He wanted to secure some glory for the expedition. At this point, no one even knew exactly where the South Pole was. It was like some kind of distant mythical land. So Scott chose 2 men to go with him, Edward Wilson, the expedition doctor and scientist, and Shackleton, who'd been eager to prove himself since day one. He wasn't picked for his experience, he didn't really have much, but for his drive and his physical strength, and probably, let's be honest, probably his charm too. Scott put him in charge of the dogs, which sounds great until you realize that Shackleton had no experience with sled dogs. He was enthusiastic, but like I mentioned before, he was super impatient with everything, and the dogs suffered for it. The journey would just be a mere 1,500 kilometers or 960-mile round trip, all on foot or skis, dragging heavy sleds loaded with gear and food across soft snow, jagged pressure ridges, and the bone-chilling cold. From the beginning, it was brutal, and none of them knew that they were already suffering from scurvy, a disease that slowly eats you from the inside out. They had bleeding gums, swollen joints, open wounds that wouldn't heal. And a quick side note about scurvy, because for some reason I find scurvy fascinating, and whenever I do a story on polar regions, I love bringing up scurvy. Well, because it enters the stories naturally, because Europeans got it all the time. But it's fascinating that the Arctic people, like the Inuit, they never got scurvy. They knew how to survive in the cold. The Europeans, though, they were pretty much fumbling through it. At the time, they didn't know why scurvy happened or even what it was. Seal meat is one thing that could have helped. And a few of the men on that discovery trip suggested hunting seals, but Scott refused. He said they weren't there to butcher wildlife, that they were there to explore. Scott also resisted using skis, even though they were standing in one of the most ski-worthy environments on Earth. Eventually, they gave in because they realized they were making very little progress, and they put skis on, but it was a mess. They were falling over, they weren't trained, and they wasted huge amounts of energy just trying to stay upright. Their diet didn't help anything. They lived on hard biscuits and pemmican, which is a dense mix of dried meat and fat. And sometimes they mashed it together in a sort of tasty, fatty, biscuity soup, which sounds disgusting. It was greasy and gritty and barely enough to keep them moving. The farther they went, the weaker they got. And they still had to make the return trip. On December 30th, 1902, after nearly 2 brutal months of marching across the ice, they reached farther south than any human had ever gone. It was a big deal, at least on paper. The Royal Geographic Society loved records and prestige, and even though they were still hundreds of miles from the pole, this milestone was enough to earn bragging rights. But behind it all was a slow-motion breakdown. They were falling apart. Their clothes were constantly soaked in sweat, which froze in the wind. The sun never set, so there was no night, no rhythm, just endless marching and fatigue. They were starving, frostbitten, and really deep into scurvy. The dogs were dying one by one, and Shackleton, who'd been coughing up blood for weeks, was fading fast. Some days he couldn't even pull his share of the sled. Scott didn't want to turn back, though. Admitting defeat just wasn't his thing. But Wilson finally convinced him that if they didn't retreat now, none of them would make it home. And that was the turning point. It was a quiet, heavy moment after they took a photo. It was a historic triumph, immediately followed by a slow, bitter unraveling. Scott was frustrated. Shackleton had become a burden. And their once friendly dynamic had turned into resentment. And the tension between them finally hit a breaking point. One night, Shackleton overheard Wilson telling Scott quietly that he didn't think that Shackleton would last the night. And that comment stuck with him. Years later, he said that it lit a fire inside of him. Shackleton wasn't going to die out there. He was going to make it back, just to prove them wrong, if nothing else. After nearly 3 months on the ice, they staggered back to the Discovery, barely alive, exhausted, frostbitten. Shackleton was thin, sick, and emotionally wrecked. And Scott made a really significant decision at that moment. He sent Shackleton home on the very next relief ship. To Scott, it made sense, one less weakling to worry about. But to Shackleton, it was a public humiliation. It was painful. He hadn't finished the expedition. He hadn't earned the glory. And he didn't have a chance to prove himself. Years later, one doctor even hinted that Shackleton wasn't as sick as Scott claimed, that maybe the real reason he was sent home was political. But either way, a rivalry was born. Shackleton kept it mostly to himself, but he took that humiliation and turned it into fuel. He wasn't done with Antarctica, not even close. And before he even left those Antarctic waters, he was already planning his return trip. In 1904, Shackleton returned home from Antarctica with frostbitten fingers, a bruised ego, and a point to prove. And when he stepped off that ship, the media swarmed him. At that moment, he was the only Discovery crew member back in England, which meant all eyes, all headlines, and all curiosity landed squarely on him. And Shackleton played it pretty well. He enjoyed the spotlight, he gave talks, he charmed journalists, and he leaned into the role of the dashing young explorer. Quietly, though, he carried a different belief. The real incompetence wasn't his, he thought. It was Scott's, for getting their ship stuck in the ice in the first place. When Scott eventually returned, the narrative shifted. On his speaking tour, Scott began dropping little references, little barbed comments to the ill comrade who had to be sent home early and who they had to lug back on the sleds. He never said Shackleton's name, but he didn't have to, because Shackleton knew exactly who he was speaking about, and he hated it. The implication that he was weak, expendable, unfit for the ice really pissed him off. He couldn't do much about it at the time, so life just moved on. He and Emily ended up getting married, and she was patient, kind, and came from money. Her father had just died, leaving her with a modest inheritance, enough to fund a comfortable life, complete with 2 servants. It sounds extravagant, but that was pretty typical of the time for middle and upper class couples, even if they didn't have children. But appearances couldn't hide the truth. Shackleton wasn't built for domestic life, and he definitely wasn't built for financial stability. He didn't want to live off his wife, but to Emily, she was pretty supportive. That was the whole point. She believed her money would spare him from the soul-deadening necessity of earning his living. In her words, one must not chain down an eagle in a barnyard. She was ready to support this legend in the making, a visionary. But what she didn't realize was just how much that choice would cost her. By 1905, Shackleton and his wife had their first child. And at that time, Shackleton was out of work, chain smoking, and fighting what may have been asthma or maybe even the first signs of heart and lung trouble that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And he refused to see a doctor about it. By this time, Emily's inheritance was running out, and Shackleton was restless again. That same year, Roald Amundsen broke through the Northwest Passage, making headlines worldwide. Suddenly, polar exploration was back in the spotlight. For Shackleton, it was like a drug. Antarctica started whispering to him again. He began pitching wild ideas, claiming that the frozen continent might become another Klondike, rich with minerals and precious stones, and would make everybody rich. Anything to make it sound lucrative. And anything to give himself and potential backers a reason to go back. But beneath the big talk and ideas was a man unraveling. He was having affairs left and right, emotional ones, physical ones. He wrote long, passionate letters to other women while his wife raised their infant son alone. Sometimes it wasn't even romance, it was just convenience. A free place to stay, a little bit of financial help, a listener who believed in him. Shackleton had a gift for making women feel seen, needed, and caught up in his vision. But the truth was, it was always Shackleton who needed something. To some extent, he was a product of his time. You know, that Victorian society, they celebrated men who chased glory while their wives kept the home fires burning, took care of the families. And ambition was seen as a virtue, even if it came at the expense of the family. But even with those standards, Shackleton pushed it. He didn't just chase adventure, he burned through money, relationships, and trust. He was loyal to his crew at sea, but not always to his family on land. He was capable of deep empathy, but often blind to the destruction that he left behind. He overspent constantly, chased high-risk adventures, and refused to slow down. That restlessness was a compulsion that bled into every part of his life. Emily gave birth to their second child in 1906, and she was in the depths of postpartum depression. Shackleton never told her what was coming. Only at the last possible moment did he tell her his plan. He was going back to Antarctica. He said it would be quick, a year, maybe 18 months at most, but that wasn't the truth. Because what began as a promise of a short trip became Shackleton's reality for the next 14 years. For Emily, it meant raising a family alone. For Shackleton, it meant chasing a dream that would absolutely consume him. By 1907, Shackleton was done being a supporting character in Scott's story. If he was going back to Antarctica, it would be on his terms. Back in London, he and Emily settled into a rhythm. She even convinced him finally to see a heart specialist. And the diagnosis was kind of unclear, possibly asthma, maybe early signs of heart disease, but none of it mattered to him. Shackleton was already planning to be back on the ice. Enter the Nimrod Expedition. The name came from a biblical hunter, which kind of felt right in Shackleton's world. He wasn't just chasing the South Pole, he was chasing redemption, glory, and a legacy no one could take from him this time. But the expedition was stitched together in desperation and pure Shackleton charm. Turns out that financing an Antarctic journey was a total nightmare. He begged wealthy patrons, flattered donors, and made promises he couldn't possibly keep. One of the biggest names to back him was Scottish industrialist William Beardmore. And Shackleton, as a side note, was having an affair with Beardmore's wife at the time. And some said Beardmore only funded the expedition to get him off the continent, get him away from his wife. Eventually, Shackleton scraped together enough money to buy a second-hand ship, also named Nimrod. It looked more like a tugboat than a vessel destined for greatness, but it would have to do. This wasn't your typical scientific expedition. Sure, they'd study rock samples and penguins to keep the funders happy, but Shackleton's real goal was one thing only: reach the South Pole, plant the flag, and make history. He even asked for advice from the great Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, who flat out told him his plan was madness. Shackleton just ignored him. Instead of using dogs like the Norwegians, he decided to bring horses. Every experienced explorer warned him that it was a terrible idea. Horses couldn't handle the cracks in the ice, and they wouldn't survive the cold, or they couldn't survive lacking the proper food. But Shackleton didn't care. He didn't trust dogs, mostly because he didn't understand them, and thought that horses were just simpler. Before setting off, he wrote to Beardmore's wife and said, "I will not be back for 2 years, and then I hope to have got the pole safe for this country. I wish I could see you and have a long talk." So he sailed south again, chasing glory and leaving chaos in his wake. This expedition was not smooth sailing. The little ship was overcrowded right from the start, the funding barely held together, and his choice of horses quickly proved to be a disaster. The animals collapsed in the cold, had to be shot, and the men ended up dragging the sleds themselves. Still, Shackleton pushed the expedition inland. Along the way, they stumbled on a massive glacier, the first real route up the polar plateau. Shackleton promptly named it after his chief sponsor, William Beardmore, which is a wee bit awkward considering he was also having an affair with Beardmore's wife, but whatever. You gotta do what you gotta do to keep the funders happy. And then they climbed the Beardmore Glacier, which was this enormous wall of ice that no one had ever scaled before, and somehow made it onto the polar plateau. From there, Shackleton chose 3 men, Frank Wild, Eric Marshall, and Jameson Adams, to go with him on the final push to the pole. They hauled sleds day after day, their breath freezing in the air, their bodies weakening, and they got close, really, really close. They made it to within about 150 kilometers or 97 miles of the South Pole. That's it. They got so close. After more than 2 months on the ice, it was right there just beyond the horizon. But they were out of food, dangerously low on strength, and nearly out of time. If they kept going, they knew they'd die. So Shackleton made the call and turned them back. And in the hyper-macho world of the early 20th century exploration, turning around or quitting was unthinkable. Just die instead, and then you become a hero. But that moment would actually come to define him. This is where Shackleton started to show what made him different. He refused to gamble men's lives for his own glory. He didn't chase the flag at the cost of his crew. He chose survival, and every one of them made it home. That decision, stopping just short of the pole, actually made him a national hero. He was knighted, he was splashed across papers. The man who got closer to the pole than anyone ever had before, and the man who brought back everyone alive. But fame fades fast. Just 2 years later, in 1911, Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole. There's no drama, no failed horses, just dogs, discipline, and precision. And they also used skis. A month later, Scott staggered to the pole, only to perish on the return journey with his crew. His death and the loss of his men became a national tragedy. Britain built statues, poems were written, the myth of the noble sacrifice took hold. And Shackleton? Well, he became yesterday's news. But Shackleton wasn't finished. If he couldn't be the first to the pole, he'd be the first to cross the entire continent. Back home, his marriage was under strain. He was restless again, irritable, and just bored with domestic life. He was infatuated with another woman who was young and wealthy and full of promise, and still entangled with Beardmore's wife, though she had kind of started to pull away from him. But even as his personal life fractured, one last grand mission was taking shape. And that was the Endurance Expedition. Shackleton's next idea was pretty outrageous. Cross the entire Antarctic continent, coast to coast via the South Pole. It would be a brutal 2,900 kilometer or 1,800 mile march across terrain no one had ever crossed. So he launched the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. This plan required 2 ships. One would sail into the Weddell Sea, where Shackleton and a small party of 6 men and 70 dogs would begin the crossing. From there, they'd begin the long march across the continent, passing through the South Pole. The other would land on the opposite side in the Ross Sea, where a second team would lay down supply depots towards the pole, including one at the base of the Beardmore Glacier. Without those supply depots, Shackleton's party wouldn't survive. And it demanded near-perfect coordination. 2 crews, thousands of miles apart, no way to communicate. And yet Shackleton had no doubt that it would work perfectly. At 40 years old, Shackleton wasn't just chasing adventure, he was chasing relevance. The pole had slipped through his fingers, and this was a shot at something bigger. But before he could conquer the continent, he had to find the money. Raising the funds turned out to be harder than the logistics, and maybe harder than the ice march itself. Grant after grant fell through, investors stopped replying to him. Even the Royal Geographic Society, who Shackleton spent a lot of time with earlier, were more supporters of Scott, but they gave Shackleton about £1,000. Their official statement was that they supported him generally, but not with complete approval, which was really just a way of them saying that we're still with Scott, not with you. Eventually, a wealthy Scottish businessman came through with a major donation, £24,000. The British government followed with £10,000. But it still wasn't enough, so Shackleton did what he had to do, what he always did. He hustled. He promised a book, he sold the rights to the photo and motion picture footage, he agreed to do a massive lecture tour upon his return, and he was good at it, better than most. Shackleton could talk almost anyone out of their money. But it all rested on one tiny, dangerous assumption, that he would survive. Shackleton scraped together enough to purchase a Norwegian ship named Polaris. It had been built for the ice, but only for short-range Arctic hunting trips. The ship wasn't built for hauling men and dogs across Antarctica. Shackleton renamed her Endurance, inspired by his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." And this wasn't just any ship. Endurance was 144 feet long, built of oak and green heart, and ironwood so dense that it actually sinks in water. Her hull was sheathed in 2 feet of solid timber designed to withstand crushing pressure from pack ice. She wasn't fast, she wasn't flashy, but she was built to take punishment. Sturdy, beautiful, elegant even, some said, for a workhorse. As Endurance set sail, fully loaded and bound for Antarctica, no one on board knew they were about to step into one of the greatest survival stories in history. Shackleton had the vision, but he needed a crew willing to risk their lives chasing it. And somehow he found them. By late 1913, applications were pouring in. Over 5,000 men wanted to be on the journey. You've probably heard of the legendary ad, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of darkness, safe return doubtful." It's one of the most quoted lines in polar history, except no one's ever found the ad itself. Maybe Shackleton never placed it, or maybe it's just the kind of myth that survives because it feels like it could be true. But either way, from that mountain of letters, Shackleton chose just 27 men. And you might be asking, well, how did he choose them, Stacy? Well, let me tell you. Not by their qualifications or their physical strength. Shackleton picked by instinct, pure vibes. Could this man keep morale up in the endless dark? Would he hold steady when everything else fell apart? Shackleton understood that it wasn't just a physical expedition, that it was actually going to be psychological warfare. So who made the cut? Well, there was Frank Worsley, the walrus-mustached New Zealander with the soul of a pirate. He was a brilliant navigator, a little eccentric, and Shackleton's right-hand man. Frank Wild was Shackleton's second-in-command from the Nimrod days. He was loyal and tough as nails. If Shackleton was the father of the expedition, Wild was the big brother, always steady and always there, and he worshipped Shackleton. Tom Crean was the quiet Irish powerhouse who'd once hauled a dying teammate 50 miles back to base, then walked 20 hours alone for help. And Shackleton trusted him completely. Harry McNish was the ship's carpenter. He was gruff, opinionated, Scottish. He was skilled and indispensable. He could fix or build almost anything. Others rounded out the team, like surgeons, Macklin and McElroy. One day they'd be amputating frostbitten toes, the next day they'd be passing around the banjo. Shackleton did learn one lesson from Amundsen, the man who had beaten him to the pole, who told him, "You lost because you didn't ski." So this time, they had skis. And dogs. Lots of dogs. So the team was assembled, the ship was ready, and every man believed they were setting off for glory. What they weren't ready for was everything that came next. On August 8, 1914, the Endurance finally sailed from England. And this was just 4 days after Britain entered World War I. Shackleton even offered to enlist instead of sail, but he was turned down and told that the country needed heroes and hope, just as much as it needed soldiers. The ship made its way to Buenos Aires while Shackleton stayed behind, still hustling to find money. He caught up weeks later, and not a moment too soon, because the ship was on the verge of chaos. The men were restless, drinking, fighting, and discipline has gone by the wayside. Shackleton snapped things back into shape pretty fast, and the worst offenders were dismissed. The rest were reminded loudly that on this expedition everyone worked. There was no officers' club, no pampered scientist, sailors, surgeons, even the carpenter. Every man was part of the machine. And the ship was also getting noisier. 69 sled dogs were brought aboard. Soon the deck was a madhouse of barking, snarling chaos, dogs with names like Satan, Surly, Nobby, and Shakespeare. The bonds between men and dogs formed fast, though. And then came the wild card. Percy Blackborough, a teenage stowaway. Nobody noticed him until they were at sea, and Shackleton was not amused. He hauled the kid in and told him that if we run out of food and have to eat somebody, you go first. Percy didn't blink and replied, "They get a lot more meat off you, sir." So Shackleton cracked a smile and put him to work with a cook and let him stay. This crew wasn't just skilled, they were weird, gritty, and fiercely loyal to Shackleton. He hadn't built just a team, he'd built a brotherhood. And soon that brotherhood would be tested in ways none of them could imagine. They reached South Georgia Island on November 5th, the last outpost of civilization before Antarctica. The Norwegian whalers there gave Shackleton a blunt warning, saying, "Wait, don't go anywhere yet." And they knew the sea better than anyone. This year, they said the ice was worse than usual, and their advice was to skip the season altogether. But Shackleton wasn't one who waits. He had men, supplies, and that dream, and he wasn't about to let hesitation stand in his way. To the whalers, this whole operation looked pretty chaotic, even doomed. They said the Endurance didn't stand a chance in the ice. But Shackleton's charisma worked its usual magic. They ended up resupplying him with flour, sugar, butter, and even cold weather gear, which you'd think that they would have enough of. But it was enough to keep the voyage moving forward. And maybe Shackleton had been racing to South Georgia for another reason too, to get out of England before anyone started asking hard questions about the finances. This expedition wasn't just an adventure, it was also an escape. On the surface, Shackleton was his usual self, charming, confident, unstoppable, but in his last letter to Emily, he called himself a domestic failure, a man full of regrets. It was the kind of letter you write when you don't expect to come back. And with that, after a month of waiting, the Endurance turned south, sailing from South Georgia into the Weddell Sea, one of the most dangerous stretches of open ocean on the planet. That sea is notorious, with drifting pack ice welded together by the wind and the currents. The floes could close in overnight and carry a ship hundreds of miles off course. There were no sheltered anchorages anywhere, so once you sailed in, it would be the ice that would decide whether you got out or not. Even the Norwegians, the greatest ice navigators of the age, who worked in the Southern Ocean for a living, avoided the Weddell Sea. But Shackleton pressed on. But for now, morale was really high. Everyone was excited, spirits were up, they had banjos and optimism, and just enough overconfidence to carry them forward. Then, sooner than anyone expected, the horizon shifted. The first shards of sea ice appeared, exactly as the whalers had warned. As the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, she was holding pretty strong. The seas were calm, the men were singing and laughing, spotting whales and wildlife as they sailed south. They even crossed the Antarctic Circle, Shackleton's fourth time doing so, and they were closing in on their landing site at Vassal Bay. 3 days out of South Georgia, the pack ice appeared. The whalers had been right. Shackleton hadn't expected it this far north, not this early in the season, but turns out those whalers knew what they were talking about. At first, it was almost exciting to the men. The Endurance plowed through the floes pretty easily, but as the weeks wore on, the novelty faded. The floes grew thicker and harder. The ship slowed down, and then she just stopped slicing through. By late January, the Endurance was boxed in. The men fought desperately to keep her free, sawing ice channels, smashing ice with poles, even clawing at the floes with their bare hands. It was like trying to carve a highway through a glacier with spoons. For a week, all they could see on the horizon was ice. As the Endurance battled its way into the Weddell Sea, the expedition's second ship was preparing for the other half of the plan, laying those supply depots on the far side of the continent. On Christmas Eve 1914, the Aurora sailed from Tasmania, bound for McMurdo Sound on the Ross Sea. The mission was critical. That was laying the chain of supply depots across the Ross ice shelf. If it all went well, Shackleton's crossing party would arrive months later from the other side, surviving only because of those supply depots. But Commander Aeneas McIntosh faced disaster from the start. When he arrived in Tasmania, he found the Aurora in terrible condition. It was barely seaworthy and needed repairs badly. Shackleton had already spent most of the expedition's funds, leaving McIntosh just £1,000 to work with. So he scrambled and took out loans, called in favors, and patched the ship up with sheer force of will. And somehow he got it to McMurdo Sound in January of 1915. But the problems didn't end there. When the shore party began hauling sleds, they discovered how badly under-equipped they were. They didn't have enough sleds. Essential supplies were missing. They didn't have pemmican, which most polar parties relied on. They had no proper tents. Everything felt rushed and incomplete, but they kept pressing on. One of the crew was Ernest Wild, Frank's brother. As he dragged his sled across the ice, he sometimes looked to the horizon, half expecting to see his brother appear over a snowdrift. But no one came. For 3 weeks of brutal work covered just 240 kilometers or about 150 miles. The dogs collapsed, they were underfed and overworked, the men weren't much better, but they pushed forward anyways. They had to because Shackleton's life and the lives of the crossing team depended on them. By February, the Endurance was in real trouble. The final blow came on February 24th. The Endurance stopped moving, not slowed, not stalled, but just stopped, frozen solid in a vice grip of ice. The crew tried everything. They fired up the engines, sawed channels, even tried blasting their way out with dynamite, but nothing worked. The Endurance was trapped. Shackleton kept up his usual bravado, but in his diary he wrote a single word: drift. The dream of a Trans-Antarctic crossing, the whole point of this expedition, was gone. They had traveled over 19,000 kilometers or 12,000 miles, fought through the pack ice, and now they were frozen in place. Just 100 kilometers or 60 miles from land. For the crew, it was absolutely maddening. Shackleton kept insisting that it would be fine, that they'd break free eventually, that they'd still make the crossing, but some of them weren't buying it. Harry McNish, the carpenter, started insulating parts of the ship, preparing for a winter locked in the ice. And every day the floes carried them further from land. On both sides of Antarctica, the story was the same. 2 ships, undersupplied, underfunded, and powerless against the ice. The Endurance had been stuck in ice before. Normally, with a bit of pressure and a bit more patience, the floes would shift, and it would break free. But not this time. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and then the temperature plummeted. The sun dipped lower every day, barely skimming the horizon. By March, there was no more pretending. The ship wasn't going anywhere. They'd be wintering aboard the Endurance, hundreds of miles from land. And worse, they were drifting. Slowly but steadily northward, away from Vassal Bay and away from the continent itself. Shackleton called the men together, and his message was blunt. The expedition was no longer about crossing Antarctica. Now, it was about staying alive. Instead of panic, though, he gave the men structure. The Endurance became a floating barracks. They organized watches, dog training lectures, games, and exercise routines. He insisted that the men shave, and they even held birthday parties. And when they ran out of flour, they baked cakes from seal blubber, which sounds tasty as hell. And then when morale dipped, they threw puppet shows and read novels out loud. Worsley even hosted geography quizzes. They played football on the ice, anything to keep their minds moving and the madness at bay. But beneath the games, the pressure was always there. The ship groaned, creaked, moaned in the night as the ice shifted and heaved, squeezing the ship. Worsley described it like this. He said the noise was like an enormous train with squeaky axles, and underfoot the moans and groans of damned souls in torment. The crew reinforced the hull with beams and braces. They chipped at the ice daily, but deep down they all knew the Endurance wasn't built to survive a full winter locked in the Weddell Sea. On May 6th, it happened in the dead of night. A violent southeasterly gale howled down from the Ross ice shelf, tearing into McMurdo Sound. The Aurora, held just by a few cables and no ice anchors, didn't stand a chance. In the middle of the night, the storm ripped her loose and hurled her out to sea. 18 men were still aboard. The shore party heard the screech of metal on ice, ropes snapping, and then silence. By morning, the Aurora was gone. And with her went almost everything the men needed to survive on the ice. McIntosh had believed that the ice was so solid that he'd left nearly all of their supplies aboard. Warm clothing, rations, navigation charts, even his own journal. Now he and 9 men were stranded in a tiny hut. No radio, not enough food, and not enough winter clothing. And no way of knowing where Shackleton was or even if he was still alive. But Shackleton and his men's survival depended on them. The only way that his crossing could succeed was if those supplies were laid. So in rags of clothing and half-starved, they kept dragging the sleds across the ice. The dogs were collapsing, the men were collapsing, but they kept going. They were suffering for a man they might never see again. Laying supplies for a crossing Shackleton had already abandoned. Back in the Weddell Sea, the Endurance drifted farther from land every day. In 4.5 months, she had traveled over 1,000 kilometers or 650 miles, most of it northward, away from their goal. When tensions rose, Shackleton shaved his head and the men followed. Long hair, he said, was a warning sign of discontent. One afternoon, Thomas Ord Lees took a bicycle out across the ice and vanished. A search party had to go look for him and found him, and he brought him back alive. But it wasn't the first time that Lee's eccentric streak caused problems. He was a fussy officer, never really quite fit in with the crew, but Shackleton kept him anyways, figuring that even difficult men had their use. But there was one thing that Shackleton couldn't manage, no matter how carefully he kept the men busy. The sun disappeared. The long polar night began. No sunlight, no warmth, just 138 days of darkness. Let me know how you would fare in 138 days of absolute darkness, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the ice, in Antarctica. I'd lose my mind after day 4, I think. By September 1915, the Endurance had been locked in the ice for over half a year. At first, the pressure came and went, and then the ice would groan, heave, squeeze, and then it would just relax. But in October, things changed. The ice began grinding with terrifying force that they hadn't seen before. Blocks the size of houses were thrown into the air like toys. The ship twisted violently, the hull bending, and Shackleton wrote that it's as if she were a living thing fighting for her life. Planks buckled and beams splintered and then water poured in. The men fought for 3 exhausting days, hacking at pressure ridges with axes and ice chisels, forming bucket brigades, setting up pumps, and trying desperately to stop the leaks. But it was a losing battle. 10 million tons of ice were grinding against the ship's sides. Timbers nearly a foot thick snapped like matchsticks. On October 24th, the main beam had shattered below deck. The Endurance was dying. 2 days later, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. And on that very same day, across the continent, a different disaster was unfolding. Near McMurdo Sound, those 10 men huddled on an ice floe, marooned, with most of their supplies gone with the ship, and scavenging what they could from remnants of old camps. Tensions were rising, and Ernest Joyce raged at McIntosh, blaming him for leaving the ship without proper leadership or preparation. McIntosh defended himself, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. 2 expeditions, 2 coasts, and 2 disasters unraveling. And winter hadn't even begun. And then the Endurance was gone. The ice finally had done what it was threatening to for months. It crushed the ship. Just like that, 28 men and 69 dogs were stranded on one of the most unforgiving places on Earth, adrift on a slab of drifting sea ice. They were now castaways in Antarctica. It had been nearly a year since anyone had heard from them, which is crazy. And they didn't know that they were in trouble, let alone where to look for them. There were no helicopters, no long-range search planes. This was 1915. The nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and they weren't properly equipped to survive as castaways. They had only 18 reindeer sleeping bags for 28 men because the original plan was just to have a small party camp on shore. Now, Shackleton faced the unthinkable. He had to keep every one of these men alive. In his journal, he wrote, "I pray to God I can manage to get the whole party to civilization." But privately, he admitted something else, something more dangerous. He hadn't chosen this crew for survival. He'd chosen them for a transcontinental march, a mission that no longer existed. Some men didn't get along, tension had always simmered, and now, with no ranks, no routines, no mission left to cling to, those old cracks were about to widen. Shackleton laid down one rule: survival came first. Titles didn't matter, resentments didn't matter, ego, position, experience, all of it was stripped away. The only rule was simple. If they were going to make it out, they had to do it together. And there was one other threat that Shackleton didn't want to speak about, and that was my favorite topic, scurvy. It's like scurvy and polar bears are my thing. I don't know why. But for decades, it had haunted polar explorers. Slow, agonizing collapse of the body caused by a lack of vitamin C. And at the time, no one knew why. But some men had noticed something strange. Seals and penguins didn't seem to get scurvy, they thought, so they started speculating maybe there was something in their flesh, something in them that protected them against it. Shackleton didn't wait for proof. He doubled down. He was basically the opposite of Scott, who didn't want to kill anything. Shackleton was like, let's kill every living being we see that isn't us. And so he did. They doubled down, and they would kill seals and penguins, and they would eat the entire animal, not just the meat, but the liver, kidneys, hearts, even the brains. And amazingly, they stumbled onto the truth. Those organs were rich in vitamin C. It wouldn't be proven by science for another 25 years, but they got lucky. Not out of knowledge, but out of desperation. On October 30th, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to set up camp. They called it Ocean Camp, a name that kind of sounded like a holiday brochure, but in reality, it was the opposite. The crew moved everything from the ship that they could. Anything useful. Frank Hurley, the photographer, he even dove into the freezing hull to rescue his glass negatives. And the Endurance didn't go quickly. For weeks, she sat there groaning, tilted and twisted, and finally, on November 21st, she gave one long, shuddering sigh and disappeared beneath the surface. By now, the ship had drifted over 2,000 kilometers or 1,300 miles into a part of the Weddell Sea that no one had ever seen before. Now, 28 men stood on a drifting slab of sea ice, not panicking, not frozen with fear, but trying to turn wreckage into survival. By late December, the ice around Ocean Camp began to heave and buckle. Staying put was no longer safe. Shackleton's new plan was march to Paulet Island, 560 kilometers or 350 miles away, where a cache of emergency supplies from an earlier expedition might still be waiting. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. The caravan of people and dogs stretched a half a mile across the ice floes, men dragging lifeboats and sleds through slush and snow, and at any moment the ice could split beneath them. They sank up to their hips at times, exhausted and wet and starving. They called it the march, and in reality, though, it was a crawl. After 7 days, they covered just 7 miles, and at that pace, it would take a year to reach Paulet Island. And no one even knew if the supply still existed there. The stress was becoming unbearable, and for one man in particular. Harry McNish had been working non-stop reinforcing lifeboats, salvaging wreckage, building sleds from splintered planks, and he had frostbite, agonizing hemorrhoids, and was starving like everyone else. Sitting was torture, and now Shackleton demanded more hauling and labor and more miles. And then on December 22nd, McNish snapped. He told the men what no one else dared to say, that Shackleton no longer had any authority over them, because the Endurance was gone and their obligation to follow orders had gone with it. Technically, he wasn't wrong. The ship's articles usually only apply at sea, and they were on sea ice. McNish was sharp, respected, physically imposing, and others were listening to him. It was a direct threat to Shackleton's leadership. So Shackleton acted fast. He gathered the men and read aloud from the ship's articles, pointing to a special clause he added that extended his authority on land or sea. Disobedience, he warned, was punishable by force, and the implication was clear that you could be shot if you didn't obey. And it was kind of theater, but it worked. The camp fell silent and the rebellion fizzled. McNish backed off, but Shackleton never forgot that moment. Finally, the march was over. It was useless. On December 29th, they stopped dragging the boats and set up camp again, this time on another drifting ice floe. They called it Patience Camp, and the name said it all, because patience was really all they had left. Speaking of patience, these long-form deep dives take weeks of research, writing, editing, and sometimes it feels like I'm stranded on my own little ice floe named Patience Camp. Or Frustration Camp, or Why is my computer freezing again camp. Totally relatable to the early 1900s. So if you'd like to help keep this channel going and fuel the next expedition into stories like this, consider joining my Patreon. You'll get behind the scenes extras, updates on what I'm working on, and it makes a massive difference in helping the channel going. All right, let's get back to Shackleton, still stranded on the ice. So this is where time became the enemy. Days bled into weeks, and weeks bled into months, and every morning they'd scan the horizon, hoping to see land. Every night, they'd fall asleep with the sound of ice cracking beneath them. It was like living on a ticking time bomb. On the surface, morale held up pretty well. Worsley said that there wasn't a pessimist among them. But Shackleton, he required that every man sign a contract agreeing to hand over their diaries at the end of the expedition. So much of what they wrote was kind of self-censored because of that. The cracks were showing in other ways. There was depression and anxiety and even suicidal thoughts. Shackleton fought it constantly. He rotated tent assignments to prevent cliques from forming. Officers bunked with crew. He monitored moods like a hawk. And if someone started to spiral, he was right there, giving them something to do to keep their minds occupied. By January, they drifted across the Antarctic Circle into a stretch of the Weddell Sea that no one had ever been to before. It was unexplored only because the pack ice usually kept ships out. Now, the irony is kind of bitter because they were charting these new waters, but only as castaways drifting at the mercy of the current. On the far side of the continent, Shackleton's supply-laying team had been on the ice for nearly a year. But in early 1916, 6 of them set out on their biggest push yet, nearly 400 miles across the Ross Ice Shelf to the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. This team was led by McIntosh alongside with Ernest Joyce, Richard Richards, Reverend Arnold Spencer Smith, Ernie Hayward, and Ernest Wild, Frank's brother. At the Beardmore Glacier, they stumbled across one of Shackleton's old tents. Wild, who was a little bit optimistic, said that maybe they had already been there. It was from Shackleton's Nimrod Expedition. But they did what they came to do. They left 2 weeks of food and fuel for 6 men and then turned back. But by then, Spencer Smith could barely walk. He was left in a tent with the promise that they'd return, and he never made it out alive. They weren't using skis, so every step sunk them deep into snow. Their clothes were shredded. Blizzards kept them tent-bound for days, and soon after, McIntosh and Hayward collapsed. Joyce, Richards, and Wild pushed on, reaching another supply depot, and then went back for the others. By the end, Spencer Smith was dead, McIntosh and Hayward vanished. In total, they'd marched nearly 1,300 kilometers or 800 miles, farther than Shackleton's men would ever make it on the other side. Patience Camp was dreary, rain-soaked, and slowly breaking apart. Cracks appeared all through the ice, the dogs were starving, and the men weren't doing much better. Fresh meat was crucial against scurvy, but Shackleton resisted hunting too aggressively. He thought it was too dangerous, and this was his last record to cling to, that he had never lost a man under his command. So in the end, they had no choice. They had to put down the dogs. The men cried. They were hardened sailors, but broken by grief. Because this was the moment that changed everything. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about enduring the cost of survival. By April 1916, they had been trapped in the ice for more than a year. Patience Camp was splitting apart beneath them, riddled with cracks, water seeping through, with the floe groaning with every shift of the wind and current. On April 9th, it finally gave way. There was a roar and then a shudder, and then the camp collapsed around them. Tents toppled into the slush, gear scattered. The ground they had trusted for months was dissolving under their feet. Shackleton gave the order that no one wanted to hear. "To the boats," he said. All 28 men scrambled in chaos, dragging 3 lifeboats across fractured ice and lowering them into the Antarctic Sea. They rowed towards a distant hope, Elephant Island. After surviving the crush of the ship, the drift, the slow psychological grind, they now faced something worse, an ocean journey in leaking boats through some of the most violent waters on Earth. It wasn't freedom, it was the beginning of a new hell.